Hello again. Thank you for joining me for the Biomass of Trees Part 2. The deadline to submit late work for the 15-week grading period is Tuesday, November 5th at 2:30 p.m. Remember, test corrections submitted before that date will be counted on the 15-week grades. We will be taking notes today, and this is going to be as many as you need to draw a conclusion. So it's not a defined amount of slides. So please have your notebooks out and be ready to take notes. Today, you guys are going to answer the question or conclude where the biomass of trees comes from using your big brains. Hopefully, you will be able to answer the question better than those graduates from Harvard and MIT did in the video. So just a quick review of the activity you just did about the matter in photosynthesis. Remember, matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. Quickly count how many of each of the three elements, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, are in the reactants, and how many of each of these atoms, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, are in the product. Well, in the reactants, there's 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 18 oxygen atoms. In the products, there are, drum roll please, 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 18 oxygen atoms. And that is because of our handy dandy little law, the law of conservation of matter. Nothing was created or destroyed, but plants were able to turn water and carbon dioxide into oxygen and glucose. Just a quick reminder for anybody who missed this day or let it go in one ear and out the other, energy has no mass. Energy takes up no space. Therefore, energy is not matter. Matter is defined as anything that has mass and anything that takes up space. So, to answer the question, where does the biomass of trees come from? We can frame it around these 4 questions. And if I were taking these notes, I would write these 4 questions down in my notebook and leave a little bit of space under each one so that you can use the context of this lesson to answer each of these questions. Some of them you may already know, and you can answer them right here before doing anything else. Some of them you may need a little help, and that's what the next few slides are for. So the questions are, is biomass matter or energy? What atoms make up the mass of a tree? What are the reactants of photosynthesis, and what atoms are in each reactant? And what happens to each of the products of photosynthesis? So let's get into it. First question, is biomass matter or energy? So you can find this answer if you don't already know. Some of you, it's going to come right into your head. But look up the definition of biomass in your notes. Look up the definition of matter and energy in your notes. And use this picture of this student, this graduate, holding this piece of a tree. This is just a small part of a tree. And she's kind of struggling to hold it. You can see in her body language, it has some weight to it. So is biomass matter or energy? Question number 2, what atoms make up the mass of a tree? So remember, the atoms that make up living things are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, chomps. So if you look at the table to the right, this is a breakdown of a tree by mass and how much of the mass is made up of each of these 6 elements. So carbon is 45% of the mass of a tree. Hydrogen is 6% of the mass of a tree. Oxygen is 45% of the mass of a tree. Nitrogen is 2% of the mass of a tree. And phosphorus and sulfur are each less than 1% of the mass of a tree. If you go back into our super fun song, when they're telling you, so you say you want to see what I'm made of, carbon, by weight, I'm mostly this you see. It's all in the lyrics. Go back and listen to the song. It'll help you out. So my question to you is, which 2 atoms make up the majority of the tree's mass? And you can just look at the numbers right there and answer that question. Next question, what are the reactants of photosynthesis? So this is maybe our third or fourth time going over this in class. Everybody should immediately jump to the fact that the reactants of photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water. So if we remember that trees are 45% carbon and 45% oxygen by mass or by weight, which reactant in photosynthesis provides both carbon and oxygen? So look at those two reactants. Which reactant in photosynthesis provides both carbon and oxygen? Because we know that a tree is 90% carbon and oxygen. The mass of a tree is 90% carbon and oxygen. So which of those two reactants has both carbon and oxygen in the molecule? This is where you're going to start to put these things together. Finally, we're going to do a little jog around what happens to the products of photosynthesis. Now, by now, we should know that the products of photosynthesis are carbohydrates and oxygen. So if you look at this diagram on the table, you can see the carbohydrates being represented inside of the tree and the oxygen showing an arrow leaving the tree. So oxygen is actually exhaled by, well, I'm using air quotes, you can't see it, exhaled by the tree. It's pushed out of the tree, and the carbohydrates stay inside of the tree. So oxygen leaves. If you guys follow what happens to the oxygen, we breathe in the oxygen, and that's where that goes. So the trees don't need the oxygen, we need the oxygen. And then carbohydrates stay inside of the tree. And what does the tree do with carbohydrates? Well, remember, glucose is the main carbohydrate produced by photosynthesis. And there are a couple things that the tree can do with glucose. First, the tree can just use the glucose to do cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is how trees get energy, just like us. They get energy the same way that we do, except they actually make their own energy, whereas we have to eat energy. But the other four things that trees can do with this glucose is they can take the glucose and they can turn it into a biomolecule, a carbohydrate in the form of starch, right? And starch is how trees store their energy. Starch is how trees store like large amounts of energy. It's a carbohydrate. They can also take those glucose molecules and turn it into cellulose. Now, cellulose is like, think of it as bones for trees. It's a really strong molecule that gives trees their structure. It's that woody, hard plant in trees that gives them, their hardness, I guess. So they're used to build cell wall and they strengthen tree cells. We don't have cell walls in our cells, so our cells are kind of soft and squishy. Plants have cell walls, and so their cells are really hard. The other thing that can happen to glucose is, remember, glucose and carbohydrates are made of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. Lipids are also made of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. So trees can take those glucose molecules and rearrange the atoms and make lipids. So trees do make lipids, one of the biomolecules, and they make them from those glucose molecules. And then finally, we all know that trees have roots and they need to absorb nutrients. Even those Harvard and MIT graduates knew that trees needed to get nutrients from the soil. And those nutrients that trees get from the soil are phosphorus, sulfur, and nitrogen, because they don't get those from photosynthesis, right? Remember that nitrogen cycle, that phosphorus cycle, those are how there's always a place where those nutrients were absorbed up into plants. And so when plants get the nitrates, especially from the soil, they can use the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and the nitrogen from the nitrates in the soil, and they can make, dun, 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 amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. So trees use those glucose molecules, rearrange them inside of their cells, and in short, they make proteins from those molecules. So glucose is used 5 ways: starch for energy storage, cellulose for structural use, lipids, and then to make proteins by the addition of excuse me, by the addition of nitrates or nitrogen. So think about that. And now we're going to go back to our question. Oh, sorry, we're going to do an evidence recap. Remember that photosynthesis transforms light energy into stored chemical energy in the form of carbohydrates. The reactants of photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water. The products of photosynthesis are glucose and oxygen. Remember that matter can neither be created nor destroyed, but the same number of atoms can rearrange to form different molecules. Remember that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but energy can change form. Remember that energy is not matter. Take that home with you. Energy is not matter. Energy can't become matter. Matter can't become energy. Okay, so those are two separate things. We have to think of them as two separate things. 90% of the mass of a tree comes from carbon dioxide and oxygen, or sorry, strike that, rephrase it. 90% of the mass of a tree comes from carbon and oxygen. And trees get their carbon and oxygen from carbon dioxide. So if the mass of a tree is made of 90% carbon and oxygen atoms, and trees get both of these atoms from carbon dioxide, then where does the biomass of trees come from? How do trees get to be so big? So finally, in your notebook, I want you to answer these two questions. Based on what you have learned, do you agree with the Harvard and MIT students about where the biomass of trees comes from? Why or why not? And right here, you can see the Harvard and MIT students. I kind of put their thoughts in this head. They thought that it came from the soil in the form of nutrients and minerals. They thought that the biomass of a tree came from water, and they thought that the biomass of a tree came from sunlight. And so I want you've made an evaluation, you agree or disagree, and told me why. The final question is, where do you think the mass of trees comes from? Where does that biomass of trees come from? And once you write that in your notebook, you are done with today's assignment. Thanks, guys.